My friends, when you hear the word courage, what comes to mind? Most people think of soldiers charging into battle. They think of heroes facing danger without fear. They think of brave men and women who stand up against injustice, who speak truth to power, who refuse to be silenced. And they are right. That is courage. But I am here to tell you today that there is another kind of courage that is equally important, equally difficult, and equally rare. It is the courage to sit down and listen. Courage is what it takes to stand up and speak. Courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen. Let me begin with the courage to speak. Throughout history, we remember those who had the courage to speak. We remember Martin Luther, who stood before the church. We remember the suffragettes who demanded the right to vote. We remember those who spoke against slavery. We remember Churchill, who told Britain we would fight on when many wanted peace. Speaking requires courage, because speaking makes you visible. When you speak, you expose yourself to criticism. You open yourself to attack. You risk being wrong, being mocked, being rejected. It is far safer to stay silent, to blend in, to let others take the risk. I know this from personal experience. Throughout my career, I have spoken when it would have been easier to stay silent. In the 1930s, I warned about Nazi Germany. I spoke about the need to rearm Britain, and for my trouble I was ignored, dismissed, called a warmonger. My own party sidelined me. I spent years in the political wilderness because I spoke an unpopular truth. It would have been much easier to stay silent, but I could not, because I believed that speaking the truth, even when unpopular, is a moral duty. And so I spoke, and I paid a price. But when war came in 1939, Britain needed someone who had been right, and because I had found the courage to speak, I was ready to lead. That is the courage to speak. It is the courage to say what needs to be said even when no one wants to hear it. It is the courage to tell the truth even when lies are more popular. It is the courage to stand alone if necessary. This kind of courage is essential. Without it, injustice goes unchallenged. Tyranny goes unopposed. We need people who will stand up and speak. But here is what I have learned. The courage to speak is only half of what we need. The other half is the courage to listen. Now you might be thinking, what courage does it take to listen? Listening seems passive, easy, safe. Anyone can listen. But that is not true. Real listening, genuine listening, deep listening, that requires tremendous courage. Let me explain why. Listening requires the courage to be changed. When you truly listen, you open yourself to the possibility that they might be right and you might be wrong. You open yourself to having your mind changed. This is frightening. We all want to believe we are right. Listening threatens that certainty. I have sat in countless meetings with military leaders and advisors giving me different opinions. It would have been easy to hear only what confirmed what I already believed, but that would have been disastrous. Instead, I had to have the courage to really listen, even to opinions I disagreed with. I remember during the war, my military commanders told me that operations I favored were not feasible. They challenged my judgment, and I had to listen to consider the possibility that they were right. This was difficult. I am a man of strong opinions, but leadership required me to listen. That took courage. Listening also requires the courage to face uncomfortable truths. Sometimes what we hear is painful. It challenges us. It shows us our failures. It is much easier to not listen at all than to hear truths that hurt. I have had to listen to accounts of military disasters. I have had to listen to criticisms of my decisions. This was agony, but I had to have the courage to listen, because only by listening could I learn. Listening requires the courage to give up control. When you speak, you are in control, but when you listen, you surrender that control. You allow someone else to set the agenda. This is uncomfortable, especially for leaders. but it is essential, because if you only listen to what you want to hear, you will never learn anything new. I had to learn this lesson many times. In cabinet meetings, I had to resist the urge to dominate every discussion. I had to let others speak and really listen. This was hard, but it made me a better leader. Listening also requires the courage to be humble. When you speak, you can appear confident, knowledgeable, authoritative. But when you listen, you admit that you do not have all the answers. You admit that someone else might know something you do not. You admit that you have something to learn. This requires humility, and humility requires courage. In our society, we often mistake confidence for competence. We admire people who seem certain, who speak with authority, who never admit doubt, but this is foolish. The wisest people are often those who ask the most questions, who listen the most carefully, who admit what they do not know. I have known many politicians who were afraid to listen because they thought it would make them look weak. They thought they had to have all the answers, to never show uncertainty, to always appear in control. But this made them poor leaders, because they cut themselves off from information they needed. They surrounded themselves with people who only told them what they wanted to hear, and so they made terrible decisions based on incomplete information. True strength is not refusing to listen. True strength is having the courage to listen, especially to things you do not want to hear, especially to people who disagree with you. Now let me give you some examples of when listening mattered most in my own experience. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, I had to listen to my military advisors who told me we were desperately short of pilots and aircraft. Every instinct wanted to throw everything we had into the fight immediately. But I had to listen when they explained the need to hold reserves, to pace ourselves, to think long-term. That was hard. People were dying. Cities were burning. The pressure to act, to do something, anything was enormous. But I listened. And because I listened, we managed our resources wisely. We preserved enough strength to continue the fight, and we prevailed. If I had not had the courage to listen, to really hear what my advisors were telling me, I might have squandered our forces in desperate attacks that felt good in the moment but would have cost us the war. Another example. After the war, I had to listen to the British people when they voted me out of office in 1945. This was painful beyond words. We had just won the greatest war in history. I had led Britain through its darkest hour, and the people rejected me. Every instinct wanted to rage against this injustice, to dismiss the voters as ungrateful, to refuse to accept their verdict. But I had to have the courage to listen to what they were saying. They were not rejecting me personally. They were saying they wanted change. They wanted a focus on domestic issues, on rebuilding, on creating a better society at home. They were tired of war and crisis. They wanted peace and prosperity. I did not like hearing this, but I had to listen, and in listening I learned. I came to understand that the skills needed to win a war are not necessarily the skills needed to win a peace. The British people were right to choose new leadership for a new era. And when I returned to office in 1951, I was a better leader because I had learned to listen. Now let me speak to those of you who are young, who are just beginning your careers, your lives as adults. You will face many moments when you must choose between speaking and listening. My advice to you is this: learn both forms of courage. Develop the courage to speak up when something is wrong. Do not stay silent when you see injustice. Do not go along with the crowd when the crowd is wrong. Do not let fear of criticism or rejection keep you from saying what needs to be said. The world needs your voice, but also develop the courage to listen. Really listen, not just waiting for your turn to talk, not just hearing the words while you prepare your response, but genuine, deep, humble listening. Listen to people who disagree with you. Listen to people who are different from you. Listen to people who make you uncomfortable. Listen to criticism. Listen to advice you do not want to hear. Listen to perspectives that challenge your own. This is how you learn. This is how you grow. This is how you become wise. I have seen too many young people who have mastered the courage to speak but have never developed the courage to listen. They are full of opinions. They are quick to argue. They are confident in their own rightness, but they are unteachable. They are closed. They are rigid. And ultimately, they are limited. Do not be like them. Be brave enough to speak, but be equally brave enough to listen. Let me also speak to those of you who are in positions of leadership, whether in business, in government, in your communities, or in your families. Your position gives you a platform to speak. People will listen to you because of your authority. But do not let that platform become a barrier to listening. The higher you rise, the harder it becomes to hear the truth. People become afraid to tell you things you do not want to hear. They tell you what they think you want to hear rather than what you need to hear. You become surrounded by yes men and flatterers, and you become isolated from reality. You must fight against this. You must create space for people to tell you the truth. You must reward honesty even when it is uncomfortable. You must punish flattery even when it is pleasant. You must actively seek out dissenting opinions. You must listen to critics. You must hear from those who are affected by your decisions, not just from those who advise you. This requires tremendous courage. It requires the courage to hear that you were wrong, that your policy failed, that your decision hurt people. It requires the courage to face your own mistakes and failures. But it is essential for good leadership. The leader who only speaks and never listens becomes a tyrant. The leader who listens as well as speaks becomes a statesman. I want to address something important. Some of you might be thinking that listening means being weak, that it means giving in, that it means abandoning your principles. This is not what I am saying. Listening does not mean agreeing. You can listen to someone carefully and still disagree with them. You can understand their perspective and still maintain your own. You can give them a fair hearing and still reject their advice. Listening is about gathering information. It is about understanding. It is about making sure you have considered all angles before you decide. Once you have listened, truly listened, then you must have the courage to make your decision and stand by it, even if that decision is unpopular, even if people criticize you for it, even if it costs you something. That is the courage to speak again. The cycle continues. Listen, speak, listen again, speak again. Both require courage. Both are necessary. Neither is sufficient alone. Let me give you a final example from history. Abraham Lincoln, one of the greatest leaders who ever lived, understood this principle deeply. During the American Civil War, Lincoln assembled a cabinet of his rivals, men who had run against him for president, men who disagreed with him, men who thought they were smarter than he was. Why did he do this? Because he had the courage to listen. He knew that he needed to hear different perspectives. He knew that surrounding himself only with people who agreed with him would make him a poorer leader, and so he deliberately chose advisers who would challenge him, who would argue with him, who would tell him when they thought he was wrong. This required tremendous courage. It would have been much more comfortable to surround himself with loyal supporters who never questioned him, but Lincoln was brave enough to listen. And because he listened, because he considered multiple perspectives, because he had the humility to change his mind when presented with better arguments, he made better decisions. He saved the Union. He ended slavery. He became one of the greatest leaders in history, not because he always spoke the loudest, but because he knew when to speak and when to listen. So I leave you with this challenge. Develop both kinds of courage. Practice speaking up when it matters, but also practice sitting down and listening when that matters too. Do not be one of those people who is always talking, always arguing, always pushing their own opinions, but never learning, never growing, never changing. And do not be one of those people who is always silent, always passive, always afraid to express their views, to stand up for what is right, to say what needs to be said. Be someone who knows when to speak and when to listen. Be someone who has the courage to do both. Be someone who speaks truth even when it is unpopular, and be someone who listens to truth even when it is uncomfortable. This is the path to wisdom. This is the path to good leadership. This is the path to a life well lived. The world does not need more people who only know how to speak, and the world does not need more people who only know how to be silent. The world needs people who have mastered both, people who speak with conviction and listen with humility, people who stand up for principle and sit down to learn, people who are brave enough to challenge others and brave enough to be challenged themselves. That is true courage. That is complete courage. That is the courage we need. So go forward from this moment with both kinds of courage. Speak when speaking is needed. Listen when listening is needed. And have the wisdom to know which is which in each moment. This is my challenge to you. This is my hope for you. This is what the world needs from you. Courage to stand up and speak. Courage to sit down and listen. Both. Always both. Never one without the other. Thank you.